Hi, I'm Dan Sweet. I'm Director of Public Relations and Communications for Helicopter Association International, and welcome to our webinar this week. We are talking today, let me get my screen shared here, with Commander Brian Wexler, who is a retired Coast Guard pilot who sustained a crash. And he is here to give you his firsthand experience on what that was like for him. Quite honestly, this is one of the things that I really appreciate about this industry is that people like the commander who have had situations that did not end well. Honestly, it ended very, very well, considering he's here to tell us about it. But talk about some of the lessons, talk about the different things that transpired and led up to it. And that's one thing that I'm hoping that the audience can take away today is something they might have just in their back pocket to help prevent things like that from happening again. So let me introduce Commander here. I'll bring up his slide real fast. He served 15 years as a Coast Guard search and rescue pilot and a flight instructor, logging 3,200 flight hours. He also served as the U.S. Coast Guard attaché to the U.S. Embassy in Bogota, Colombia, and it's kind of fun for me, the U.S. Coast Guard's Chief of Media Relations. Both he and I apparently attended the Defense Information School in different locations. He also holds a master's degree in national defense and strategic studies and clinical counseling. And today he works as an outreach manager for the West Point Association of Graduates Rockbound Highland Home. Our webinar, as always, is interactive. We do encourage you to ask questions. Please use the question module. I know that Zoom has a question module and a chat module. We will pay attention to the chat module, but if you want to make sure your question gets answered or asked, please put it in the question module. Our webinar is also being recorded. We will try to get this posted to our YouTube channel and our website within about 24 hours. Sometimes it takes a little bit longer. Feel free to share that link. Feel free to go back and watch in case you missed something. These will stay up on the website for quite some time. And so now I would like to ask Commander Wexler to bring his camera up and we will get the webinar started.
All right, here I am.
There we go, Commander. Gosh, I appreciate your taking the time to join us today. I got to see your presentation, during the Vertical Aviation Safety Team Conference event in Dallas, Texas, about 2 months ago now, I guess it's been. And I was so impressed that I really thought that it would be a great topic to have you come on and talk to our audience today.
Well, I appreciate that, Dan. And I'd like to thank you and also Jasmine, who's working the event today, and all your team at HAI for having the confidence that anything I say today could possibly be worth these folks' busy day and their valuable time. So thank you for the opportunity. Look forward to speaking today.
I think everybody will enjoy it. In that case, I'm going to mute my camera. I will let you go ahead and bring your presentation up and take over.
Right.
Thank you so much.
I can do that. All right. Let me do this. All right. Well, as Dan said, I'm here to talk a little bit about my experience with a mishap, and that's the big story. But first, good afternoon to you all. Good morning, good evening, wherever you may be. I hope you guys are all well and you're all flying safe. And again, I'm just happy to be here in more ways than one. I'm going to start with a regret I have. We all have our regrets, and I'm going to share one with you right now. I regret that I never had the opportunity to buy this gentleman a beer. That will become important to you later, and I will explain. But that's a regret I'd like to start with. This is my airframe. This is the H-65 Dolphin helicopter. Perhaps some of you recognize it, and perhaps some of you out there listening have even flown in it or are even currently flying in it. Perhaps you've even flown with me in the past. So if you're out there, good to have you with us today. We are in a dangerous business, ladies and gentlemen, and just by the very nature of what we do, it is only a matter of time before something, somewhere, somehow, for some reason, goes horribly wrong. I'm here to talk a little bit about how we go and have gone from here to here, or perhaps here. Our job, I see it, is to push that day as far into the future as we can. And so by talking about my experience today, I hope you can take a little bit away from what happened to us and maybe apply it to the way you see your business these days, you see your flying, and how your crews see their missions unfold. I'm going to start with a little bit of history here. Several years ago, I was at a Coast Guard command that looked a lot like what you're looking at. And I had given a presentation about crew resource management, about clear communications, all those things that make crews work well together, accurate, bold, concise, all those things. And after the presentation, one of the pilots approached and he said, "Hey, sir, you know, all that CRM, what we call it, CRM stuff is really high speed and nice. But, you know, when the missions come down, sometimes we're in such a hurry and things are so busy that we just don't have time for CRM." And I thought that was funny because having totally drank the Kool-Aid about CRM and how it's an important element of everything we do in risk assessment and mission execution, I thought, well, you know, if I'm late to the drop zone, I don't take any less care packing my parachute. So I didn't understand exactly what he meant, but I said, okay, well, thank you for your perspective. And so it got me thinking about that. I said, just how integrated, how, I guess, internalized are these concepts, or are we just listening and moving on? So it got me, again, thinking and looking and finding. This is the seminary school at Princeton University. And this was the site of a little research I want to talk about. Two social psychologists by the name of Darley and Batson performed a relatively famous psychology experiment here at the seminary. And this is what they did. They wanted to find out how much your internalized ideas and beliefs about what is right and what is correct actually drive your decisions. So they went to a bunch of different classes where priests were training to become priests, I should say, and they were embedded in an instruction block about the story of the Good Samaritan. You may be familiar with it. And they designed the experiment so that they would go into each of these classrooms and they would pick their subject from the class and call them aside and say, "Hey, look, sorry to interrupt, but the headmaster and his staff would like to get a briefing from somebody about this instruction block of the Good Samaritan. We know you're right in the middle of it and you're engaged with it. So we would like you to go up and brief the headmaster." And that was the story. And then they broke the group into three different specific scenarios. One was, oh, you got plenty of time. Just be there by 3 o'clock, finish class, don't worry about it. The second group was, well, you're not late yet, but they're all there and they'll take you whenever you can get there. And then the third group was, yeah, I hate to hurry you up, but they're like in a hurry. They're ready. They're sitting at the table looking at their watches. So move along. So as each of the subjects departed, they were, of course, observed as they went up to the office. And to get there, they had to pass between two buildings separated by an alley that was about 4 or 5 feet wide. And what did each of them encounter as they went up to their briefing? That's right. Someone lying in the alley, clearly in need of help, and actually coughing and raising his hand and signaling for help. So what did they do? Coming from the Good Samaritan classroom, going to brief the Good Samaritan scenario, what did they do? Well, it broke down by time. The people who had plenty of time, 65% of those people stopped to help. The "you're not late yet" crew, about 45% of them stopped. And the "you're already late" crew, 10%, 1 out of 10 priests in training stopped to help that man on the ground. So it really isn't, at least this research would suggest, what we think we'll do. It isn't those deeply held ideas that always prevail and always win. And we'll see how this applies to our mission being our collective mission in aviation, and specifically for my flight that day that we're about to discuss. So we're going to do the right thing. We're going to stand strong. We're going to do all of that until the situation develops. And now we find ourselves in a different place. So I'm going to tell you what happened to us. Some of you recognize this. This is St. Louis Cathedral. This is in the city of New Orleans, Louisiana, here in the United States, one of my favorite cities in the whole world. And this is Coast Guard Air Station, New Orleans. This actually is a picture of our hangar, and that is our aircraft, not our specific airframe, but this is how it looked on the Dan question. So I'm on duty, and this was how the duty played out and how it still plays out in New Orleans. One crew of 4 is always there with a 30-minute launch target. The second crew is at home. Well, during a normal day, they're there as well, but at night they're home with a 2-hour launch, and maintenance is around the clock 24/7 all year long. So I was the pilot in command in the duty crew at the hangar that night. And I put a couple of notes at the bottom here. The small personnel anomaly, this would really speak directly to military folks who understand the chain of command. Normally, the senior officer present is also the senior pilot and the pilot in command of the crew. In this case, it was not that way. I was the pilot in command, but I was actually junior to the senior duty officer who was a co-pilot. So I was in charge of the aircraft and the mission, and he was in charge of everything else that happened at the unit. And it was Friday the 13th, as I write, just saying. So the call comes in from our Coast Guard colleagues in downtown in District 8 in New Orleans, and they would like to launch an aircraft. It's in the afternoon now, mid to late afternoon, and it's in January. And they would like to launch an aircraft to take a look at what has been reported as a leaky oil pipe or a pumping station, so to speak. And they got a report that was oil leaking. They needed to evaluate how much, how fast, and how they could best respond. And as you launch out over that area, this is what a lot of it looks like. This is the Mississippi River Delta. And folks who operate in the Gulf of Mexico, you clearly recognize this sort of terrain. And a lot of the crisscrossing straight lines you see there are waterways, yes, but also cuts that enable pipelines to pass through. So we're looking for something that approximates this out in the middle of that wilderness, so to speak. So we say, sure, that's great. We'll go. And they said, well, we want to send some folks from our office, some trained marine safety people with you. And we said, that's no problem. They're right across the river. They can be there quickly. So let's go. Yeah, we'll get the aircraft ready, send them. So we man up and we're getting ready to go. And the phone rings and they say, well, we're going to be delayed by an hour. Okay, that's fine. And we wait. And then the phone rings again. They say, well, it's going to be a couple of more hours, which then would have put us basically in the dark. And we said, well, sorry to hear that, but we can take off right now. We have the coordinates. We can go there and we can put eyes on, we can put a video on, we can get everything you need to evaluate. And we can go right now before it gets dark. Well, no, that's okay. We're going to send our folks. We want them to be on the aircraft. And as we repeated the reasoning about dark versus light, we couldn't understand, okay, how are you going to look at an oil spill in the dark? And they explained that there was, well, we have equipment that we can bring that can see an oil spill in the dark. It's an infrared camera. Something back in the day that looked like this. I just picked this photo, of course, but it was a small camera with a separate screen. And they said this can see oil in the dark or heat signatures, which oil would be producing. Okay. Have you used this before? We've never heard of it. Well, no. Okay. You sure you don't want us to go look in the daylight? No, it's fine. We'll just go with this. Okay. Sounds good. And so we waited and the phone rang and they said, okay, well, they're going to be a little late. They're going to be there just before midnight. Okay. And as you can see, this is pushing into, okay, what next? Why so late? Now we're in the witching hour in the middle of the night in the dark with equipment that might be questionable. We started to wonder, what was going on here? Why can't we just go at first light? So this is what we were thinking. We've never been tasked like this. We're not clear as to what the source was or what the report was. We're wondering about the urgency when, if it were that urgent, we should have been in the air when it was daylight. And we got that uneasy feeling that we're being left out. And so multiple phone calls happened up and down the chain of command as to what was really going on. And there were, I guess, some real honest things being said between senior commanders about what this entire mission was about. Something just isn't right. So we greenlight the mission and we go. So it's about midnight. They have arrived and we're loading up the aircraft. This is a picture of the cabin of an H-65 Dolphin helicopter. We would have a flight mechanic, and we did that night. There was a chair over here that he normally sits in. And we had two folks with us who were camera operators, and they would have sat basically where this cameraman is sitting right now. They would have been strapped in the aircraft in the back. So this is where I'm sitting. I'm the pilot in command. I'm in the right seat. And this is our sliding door on the right side of the screen here. And it is open in this photo. And so we're spinning up, we get them in, we brief them, everything's ready to go. And then something else happens. In the dark, on the ramp, we look at our torque meters, which are two digital vertical diodes, basically, that tell us what torque is being delivered by both of the engines. And it starts to go a little wonky. Left side goes high, then the right side goes high, and clearly the instrument is doing a dance with no secondaries reflected by the engines, by the sound, by anything else we can detect. It looks like an instrument problem. And so we look at this and we do a quick analysis, and it appears to be the instrument. And then it fixes itself. It just goes plain and everything is settled. And we stare at it for a few seconds. And we think, should we take this aircraft? Yeah, it's okay. Let's go. So I hope that some of you are having that really, really cold chill go down your spine about taking this aircraft at this time of night under these conditions. And you're absolutely right. So away we go. We roll out and we launch. And this is pretty much what it looks like. So we launch into this and we're climbing out. And we're heading south where it gets even darker than this. And we pick up a slight overcast above us, and we settle out 500-700 feet, somewhere in there. It was not completely clear in my memory how high we were, but away we went, and we started flying down into the bayou and towards our target. So as we're closing in on it, or actually about halfway to the target, something happened that we had never seen before. We were looking out, and in the ambient light that was out there, the color of the terrain basically started to change below us. It went from a detectable sort of bayou look to a plain whiteout. And it almost looked as if we were flying from terrain to a sandy beach. It was a plain change of color and a line right across the ground. And it turned out that it was a fog bank. We finally concluded that it was fog. It was like, okay, wow, that's a pretty well-defined fog bank. I've never seen anything quite like that. And it looks pretty thick. Noted. And then we thought, well, hey, does that thing back there shoot through fog? Well, we don't know. We've never tried it. In fact, they'd never tried it on any terrain. So an untested camera now over a dense bank of fog heading for our target. And so the discussion ensued. At this point, I am not on the controls. My co-pilot is flying the aircraft in the left seat. He has the controls. And we're approaching the target area. And we slow down to get the door open. So we're at 90 plus knots. We slide the door open and we get those guys on gunner's belts, which means they unstrap from the aircraft proper and they slide up into the cabin and they put gunner's belts around their waists and they hook in to the deck of the aircraft for security because they do have to reach the door and lean out the door with their equipment and shoot directly down at the terrain. So all of that is happening. The flight mech is managing the cabin back there. They're on the gunner's belts. They got the camera out and they're looking through it. They're trying to focus. They're trying to find a target with the lens. They're trying to get anything they can get on the machine, but nothing's working. And clearly they're staring directly at a bank of fog. And so we are not quite at the target yet, and we still haven't acquired anything on the camera. And then something funny happens. You remember this thing? Yes, our torque meter. This suddenly makes a reappearance. So my co-pilot says, hey, we got a torque meter problem. Brings my head to the instruments, and I look and I say, okay, torque meter problem. We're going to do what we call the big four in our procedures. NR, we're looking at the rotor, we're good. Airspeed, altitude, okay, we're 90 plus knots. We're solid at 500, 700 feet. I can't remember the exact altitude we were. Airspeed, altitude are good. Wheels, floats, don't need the wheels, don't need the floats right now. Analyze this. What do we got? And so we're looking at the torque meter, and again, no indications that it's anything other than a torque meter problem. The engines are solid. The perceived power is solid. No noise, no change in sound of the engines, and we're good. So we say, this is an indicator problem. So finally, I say, okay, that is all. We are canceling this mission. And I say, Jim, we're canceling. We're going direct home to home plate. All right, in the back, please get those guys out of the door, secure their gear, get the door closed, and let's head home. So I go down to the computer, I got my head down, I'm giving my co-pilot a direct to vector on the screen. Here we go, there you go. All right, how's it going back there? And I'm managing, as I say, what's going on. And at about that time, my co-pilot says, there goes number one. And to me, in my mind, that means we've lost an engine. Though nothing other than his words have alerted me to that. My eyes turn to the torque meter, and I'm shocked by the idea that we might have lost an engine. But before I could even process what is going on with the engine, this is a door, by the way, in the back. It's still open, and they're still on gunner's belts. Before I can process what's going on, this happens. This is the windscreen. And of course, something like this flashes up instantly. It catches my attention. My eyes come up from the instruments and the idea that we might have an engine failure. And I'm wondering why our windscreen just turned white. And I realize, oh my gosh, we're under an overcast. We have flown into the clouds. We're inadvertent. And all of this is happening within, like a 2-second window. This awareness is unfolding because we have our landing lights on. We're going to light up the clouds. And so that's it. We're inadvertent. And then I realized, wait a second, we're over a fog bank. And I look down, and this is what the altimeter looks like. Actually, the last zero there was still moving, and it was moving into its final resting place there at 0. And it took me about a microsecond to yell, climb! And that's about what I get out of my mouth, and boom. Now, to describe what happened next has always been a challenge because it's really difficult to transmit the sensation. But I try my best, and I'll try here. In the moment of impact, that moment of realization that we have struck the earth, it was, of course, a violent jerking, throwing forward motion, a tumultuous, like caught in a wave and getting rolled. Gulf of Mexico coming through the windscreen at me, along with a lot of other things that hit me in the helmet and the face mask and in the chest, and all these other things are happening. In my mind, I remember thinking again that microsecond of, holy crap, we actually hit the earth. And it's an amazing sensation even today to think back at that second. And a friend of mine, as I was talking to him, put it this way. He said, well, you actually died in an aircraft mishap and lived to tell about it. And I have to agree, because this really was about as close as you can come to dying in this kind of aircraft mishap and surviving it. So boom. And all the violent motion finally stops. And this was my view. I'm looking at it, and I lit it up a little bit because it was basically really, really dark. But I'm looking sideways at the world like this. As I start to perceive that it's still and I am holding my breath, I realize I'm also above water. I'm soaking wet, but I'm above water. And I start to process the idea that, okay, we've settled. It's time to get out of this airframe. We have crashed and I'm out of here. This is kind of how we landed. This is not my aircraft, of course, but it's the closest proximity, I guess, to represent what the airframe really looked like. The entire front of the aircraft had basically disappeared. All the windscreens, support structure completely torn away. And we were fully exposed, as you see here. We were on our left side, not our right, as you see here. So I was basically the equivalent of high on this side, of course, but on the other. And I was above the water. Halfway down the aircraft was underwater. So we were sitting in about 4 to 5 feet of water. I was above it. And my co-pilot, unfortunately, was actually underwater. I found that out as I released my 5-point harness. I fell across the cockpit on top of him as he was trying to get out. I didn't know this, of course. I was just trying to escape. And I tried to scramble out what would have been the roof, but I couldn't. My leg was caught. My left leg seemingly was caught in something, and I couldn't wrench it free. So I had to reorient myself, roll over on my back, basically, and brace my right foot against something. I don't really know what it was, and just push with everything I had. My left leg came out, and I left a good chunk of the front of my left leg in there. A bunch of skin and other tissue stayed behind, but that was okay with me. I launched out and landed out here and immediately started to swim or tread water, or at least that's what I tried to do until my feet hit the bottom. And I realized, okay, I can stand up. We're in shallow water. And just as I started to realize that, my co-pilot emerged from the water with a Heats bottle in his mouth, just burst out of the water, took the Heats bottle out of his mouth and said, "Oh my gosh, we crashed." And I know that's comical, but he actually spoke the words. And I said, "Yes, we did. We crashed." And he proceeded to climb out. But what had happened to him was, on impact, his entire survival vest, all the Velcro that holds in all his equipment, had failed on impact. And all of his gear had flown into the instrument panel, which subsequently collapsed on top of it. And he was tied to the aircraft with about 7 or 8 parachute lines, which is not good. You're not going to tear those as you just yank on them. So he yells at me, "Cut me out of here." And from somewhere, I produce a knife and I cut him out and pull him out. And he comes out and splashes into the water next to me. And immediately we turn to the back seat, or to the back in the cabin. And this is kind of what the terrain looked like, by the way. Once we stood up in vertical, again, it's lit so you can understand it, but this is basically what we were facing. So we start yelling into the back of the cabin. We go into our rescue mode because we know our flight mech and the other folks are back there. We're yelling and we're screaming and we're going, "Are you okay? Who's back there?" Our flight mechanic emerges. He comes out of the wreckage and he says, "I'm okay." He starts yelling, "Are you guys okay?" And we realize, okay, we're still missing 2 people. He turns back around into the cabin and we realize they must be underwater as well. So he goes back there and he's sloshing through, he's reaching, we're yelling, trying to locate these folks. And just moments later, a very eerie thing happened. From nearby, coming out of the fog, of the very dense fog, by the way, we see 2 people walking towards the aircraft. And I just assumed that they were residents of the area. They heard the crash and they're coming out to investigate. It turned out that those were the 2 MSO folks that were in our aircraft. It turned out that on impact, their gunner's belts had failed at the D-ring, and they were launched out of the aircraft through the open door at about 90 plus knots and basically landed full speed in the swamp, and both lived to tell about it. In fact, they lived it well enough to be able to get up, find each other, and walk towards the aircraft. And so that was kind of bizarre. So as we're coming to the conclusion that we're all accounted for and everyone's here, we go into the next phase of operation. The water is cold and it's really dark. We can't really see anything, but we do know that certain things are in the back of the aircraft that we need. One of them are our MAC 10s. You guys may be familiar with MAC 10s, basically the super heavy duty flight suits that we wear when we know we're going to be flying over cold water, over colder water, Gulf of Mexico, Alaska, of course, where you're in dry suits. But these were in the back of our aircraft. We did not wear them on the flight. But our flight mech was capable. He went back there, found them, pulled them out, and started to distribute them. Also, the life raft was back there. He got that, he pulled it out, and we deployed it. Another episode for knives, the parachute cords associated with the packaging had wrapped around the top of the raft, and so we could not deploy it until we cut those parachute cords. And so out came the knife, and boom, boom, and it inflated. And so we all kind of climbed in. Injuries, well, I knew, or I suspected strongly, that my left arm was broken or seriously damaged in some way. Adrenaline was pumping, of course, so I used it as best I could, even though I knew that there was something profoundly wrong with it. I put the flashlight up there because this was the first time we really started to worry that we didn't have sufficient light, because we could not see injury, so to speak. We could not see wounds. We could not tell the difference between what was blood and what was mud. I know that I had pulled out several pieces of the windscreen out of my chin and neck, and I knew that I had been bleeding, but we couldn't see anything. We had no light. And I know that sounds these days to be almost preposterous that you would go out there without a sturdy waterproof light on your person. Well, that's where we found ourselves. We couldn't see anything, but we did find out that we were generally okay. And this is when we started to assess the situation overall. We're okay, but we really don't know, again, the difference between mud, blood, and water. And at this point, we had one of the people asking, how are they going to find us? How are they going to find us? We've crashed out in the middle of nowhere. But we did know that we were on a comm schedule, and that I put Doug is on duty. The most capable duty stander at the entire unit happened to be on duty. Doug Thomas, former U.S. Navy, then U.S. Coast Guard. Thank goodness he was on duty. I knew that he would do the right thing. And all of the processes in place for an overdue aircraft would kick in, and they would launch. They knew we were going. They had our EPIRB pinging by now, and we were highly confident, or at least the Coast Guard aviation element of the group were highly confident that we were going to be okay. It was only a matter of time. We also talked about this. We realized that we were now in the food chain, and we were right in the middle of favorite feeding time for these guys. And we were very, very appreciative that our life raft had worked. And we talked at some length about why we would ever need to be getting out of the life raft. And if we did have a reason to do it, with no light and no idea how many of these guys, if any, were around, it kind of got to us a little bit. Okay, let's just stay in the raft unless it's really, really important. So communicating. We thought, okay, we'll just call this one in and describe where we are and what we're doing. And all will be well. However, we discovered quickly that our Prick 90, our survival radios that we had been issued with the limited frequency range, were being completely overpowered by the aircraft's EPIRB. We could not get through at all. The whole radio was washed out by the emergency signal. And we had the flares that we all carried, and we had plenty of them, and we were prepared to use them. Again, the fog was profoundly dense, and it came into play here shortly thereafter when we were preparing for rescue. We had prepared for rescue, and lo and behold, we finally hear the sound of an aircraft coming our way. It was an H-65 Dolphin from our air station. It was the B-2 crew. Doug had done his job, and he had launched the aircraft after exhaustive checks about where we could have landed. He launched the aircraft as he should have. Also, we've learned that there were Coast Guard boats launched as we expected, and they were heading our way, but they could not quite get there because of the terrain. They were blocked by, well, all sorts of swamp things, I guess, and they never really could get to us. I put this up because it's a whistle. We did gain contact with a boat crew that was some distance away, and we could tweet back and forth by whistle. I never really thought that I'd ever use a rescue whistle, but in fact, we were telling them where we were with our whistle as they tried to work their way to our location. So the aircraft became problematic in that they could not see us. They were above the fog layer, and they could not see a single thing. down to our life raft. We weren't exactly aware of it at the time, and we fully expected that they would just pull into a hover and get to work getting us out of there. We'd see a swimmer come down any minute now. But their first approach, they waved off. Their second approach, they waved off. Their third approach, they waved off. And we started to realize, oh my gosh, they can't see us and we can't tell them anything. And so during one of the approaches, it got kind of scary because we learned later that they were so hyped up, as you can imagine. They know their guys are down. They don't know how many of us are alive. They don't know anything. And they're going full bore to get to us. So during one of their approaches, the rescue swimmer in the back said, I got a visual. And the pilot at the controls, who was in the right seat, looked and started a slow, undetected descent in a right-hand turn. And the co-pilot called it, took the controls, and pulled power before they joined us in the swamp. So that put a little scare into them. And we knew that something strange had just happened. Just watching their profile and hearing the engine pull, we realized, okay, that was not normal. And so we started to worry about them because we knew we were okay. But mostly as we waited before this helicopter got here, this is what we were dealing with. So as the helicopter continued to circle, they couldn't see us, the boat couldn't reach us. And suddenly, and I say suddenly because we never expected it, didn't think about it, this appears. And a big light cutting right through the fog and finding us in it. And guess who it was? Yeah. It was this gentleman and one other guy he was with. Well, not this particular gentleman, someone driving this boat. And he pulled up next to us as if nothing had happened at all and just said, we're here to get y'all. And just said, all right, let's go. And we looked at each other in amazement and we all climbed aboard this airboat. And I chose this picture not because this is exactly what it looked like, but more like this is exactly what it felt like. Driving through the swamp in the middle of the night at high speed, having been through what we'd been through. It was a rather surreal experience, to say the least. And so bombing through the swamp on this airboat, this is what my mind saw, this really crazy scene of how the heck did we ever land in this situation. They delivered us to the shore where this bus was waiting, or one like it. We were all taken in, multiple medical teams there, of course. We were all in, clothes cut off, completely evaluated and treated on the move, on our way to the hospital. And we were all okay, so to speak. Turned out my injury was a complete rupture of my entire pectoralis major up here. It had all the tendons that connect to the humerus had been torn off on impact. And so my muscle had basically scrolled up into the center of my chest, which is why I couldn't really operate my left arm normally. All the other cuts were basically superficial. I did have a really deep gash in my leg that they had to treat with special antibiotics. All the other cuts were generally minor, and everyone basically recovered. And so we're all better now. So there's a lot to talk about, but we don't have a whole lot of time to talk about this. This is stuff we could spend an entire day, an entire seminar talking about. But I'm going to hit on the high points, and then I'll open to your questions. I lead with aspire to be the 10%. And that is going all the way back to 10%. 1 out of 10 people stopped when they knew the right thing. They'd trained the right thing. They'd internalized the right thing. And so I should have been, as a mission commander, far more skeptical, far more outspoken about the nature of this mission, about the nature of the politics involved, if you can call it that. But I was not. I went along with the flow. And number 2, I put as probably my largest specific misjudgment of the entire operation when the torque meter told us not to go, and I decided to go anyway. That one is interesting in that I look back and say, what other mission would I have taken a broken aircraft on? Well, I wouldn't have taken this on a day VFR trainer. And yet you put us at night going over the swamp with a questionable mission, and now we have a broken torque meter. Now I'm going to take the aircraft. That still doesn't make sense to me. And I wish it had made more sense in the moment when I should have said, that's it, we're done. That's it. But it did not. One thing I carried for the rest of my aviation career, number 3, and as an instructor pilot, and again, for the rest of my flying time, this impacted my philosophy of emergencies profoundly. I used to test co-pilots in the idea of how convincing this emergency, whatever it may be, can be to make you forget to do your primary job. The crew's focused. Everyone's talking about this emergency. And yet you forget to do the most foundationally important thing. The only thing, when it comes down to it, you should be doing is flying that plane. And I used to say, yep, a great EP is wonderful, but if you execute a perfect EP and hit the ground inverted, then you really didn't do a good job. Fly the plane, because ultimately that's what's going to count. If you forget to fly the plane, nothing else is really going to matter. And again, that's the 3-minute wrap up of the big points I take away. I hope that in hearing this story, you guys have come up with a lot more in your own mind. Perhaps you've formed some questions to ask, and if you have, then I'd be happy to take them right now. And Dan, I'll hand it back to you. And also, don't forget the beer. I never got this guy a beer.
Wow, it sounds like he definitely earned it.
Yeah.
Let's see your screen up there. Since you do have your email address on there, it sounds like you're willing to accept questions that people might not want to ask. Send them to. Yeah, I can't tell you that story is every bit as compelling as when I heard it the first time, a month ago. And so I really appreciate you're willing to come on and share it with us again today. We do have some questions. I'm going to jump in with one of my own right off the bat. Mm-hmm. You talked about knives, you talked about the different things. Does the Coast Guard issue survival kits? Did you have one with you? The knives you talked about, were you talking about supplementing rescue kits, survival kits rather?
Yes. Well, if I recall, we had knives that were available to us. We could be issued knives, but there was not any particular standard place where the knife was carried or kept that I remember. If there had to be one, there was a sheath attached to one of the pilot's seats where a knife could be stored. Though it's interesting that you asked that question, because I hadn't really thought of that particular knife in a while, but there may have been one attached to the seat. But after this event, I always carried my own personal knife as well, attached to my person with a breakaway cord, but in a place where, a violent impact wouldn't dislodge it, so to speak. Yeah, I wish I had more information on what the Coast Guard now offers, so to speak, regarding survival stuff. But the raft, of course, and all the stuff that we had on us, to include flares and radios, flotation and whistles, mirrors, and that kind of thing. But I hope I answered a little bit of that question. Sorry.
Yeah, you did indeed. I was just curious, because you talked about almost finding a knife, and so I wasn't certain how that had worked out. So no, I do appreciate that. But that does bring up one of the questions. We had a question from Larry, who asked about the flares you were carrying. Did you actually deploy into the flares when you heard the aircraft overhead? Yeah. Or
yeah, good question, Larry. We did. I failed to mention that point. When we heard the aircraft, when we heard the first hint of aircraft, we had them ready. We had the briefing. We had them in hand. We knew which direction we were going to fire them. Everyone had been briefed on what we were going to do. And, we had fuel in the water, so we had to be quite careful about that. So yes, boom, boom, boom. We just kept launching them until we judged that the aircraft was too close to risk it, just in case. And so, yes, we deployed several of those. We had plenty, and so we used them.
We have a question from Tom asking, were you using NVGs?
Great question, Tom. I get that. Living in an Army environment now, no, we were not. Back in the day, so to speak, when we were flying, we did not even have NVGs in the aircraft. It was not a standard Coast Guard piece of equipment until years later. That's a really good question.
Question from Richard. This is a bit long, but he said, this sounds like a fear focus factor. It prevents you from seeing anything but the thing that you think is the threat. There is a physical reaction of the body that removes almost instantly the eye's ability to focus on anything but the perceived danger. Do you believe instant fear was a factor in the loss of your ability to see everything else happening on the instrument panel? And is there training that can address this beyond systems understanding to prevent that fear physical reaction?
Interesting. Okay. I'll address it this way. My scan, so to speak, the last time I took a deep interest in the instrument panel was when he said, looks like we have a torque problem again. And that is when we went through our procedures, checked our stuff, and then that was it. It was like, okay, now I'm going to manage these guys in the back. I'm talking to them. I'm working the computer, and my scan fell away from the instrument panel, basically in general. And my assumption was that Copilot was flying it. I was giving him his nav data. I was talking to the folks in the back, and I was not. And again, this goes back to fly the plane, right? My focus should have been, all right, if we're having an emergency, my job is to fly the plane. But I was not. I was doing other things when the descent began. And later, of course, it would emerge that my co-pilot was sort of focusing on the instruments, but the wrong ones. He was staring right at the torque meter, which I guess you spoke of the fear focus. His focus was on, is this going to come back? Are our engines good? So yes, he was looking at that with perhaps a significant amount of fear or angst that this was going to fail and something bad was going to happen. Meanwhile, the altimeter had already started to unwind, and he didn't notice it, and I certainly didn't notice it. When it came to the acute moment of awareness, it really happened so fast from the time he said, there goes number one, to the time I looked up, torque meter, boom, white windscreen, altimeter, boom. That was probably even slower than it happened. So that's what I can offer about the instrument focus. I hope that answers some level of your question.
It almost seems like Larry is understanding what's coming next, because he asked about the torque meters. He said, was there something else besides the torque meter failure, and did you actually lose an engine?
Really good questions. And no, the engines, best we could tell, we evaluated when we first saw, second time we saw it misbehave. There was no indication that anything else was going on with the engines. No fluctuations on pressures or temperatures or any other aspect of performance or engine health at all. It was a pure torque transducer failure. Like the torque meter was simply malfunctioning, bad signal, that kind of thing. So no, we did not lose an engine, and we had no indication that we were going to. It was a pure meter problem.
Okay, well, I'll jump through down a little bit to a question from Brandon, who has another technology question. What frequency did the handheld radio operate on, and did the Coast Guard change the frequency or what you carry because of the incident with the emergency locator beacon?
Yes, it was a 243 radio, and it was also a 121.5. I believe as well. It was like a 3-click radio. It was like an old green brick. And the Coast Guard did look into, because of this incident, look into alternative ways of communicating. And what they went with, and I don't know if this is still the case, was not necessarily a personal radio for voice communication, which is what I advocated for and thought would have best fulfilled our needs in that moment. They went with a personal beacon rather than an aircraft beacon. They went with a personally activated beacon system rather than a voice radio. So that changed, and I don't know how that's evolved since. I hope they've moved back to some semblance of a voice communication, but I'm not really sure.
Well, and I'm going to ask a question that I hope isn't a policy issue, but today's pilots in the Coast Guard, I imagine nobody's using the cell phone while they're in flight, but it's pretty easy to slip that down inside of a uniform pocket. Do pilots carry cell phones with them? I mean, would that have made a difference?
I'm going to say that they probably do. I have no direct, of course, knowledge over that. As a data-free analysis, I would call it. But yes, I'm sure they do, unless, again, there is some policy that says they can't. And I don't know what the cell service would have been like out there in the middle of basically nowhere. But that's a good point. I'm going to guess.
Sorry, one more technology question from Laura. She asks, you said something like, your co-pilot said, there goes number one. Did you ever find out what he was referring to?
He was talking about his belief that we had in fact lost an engine because the torque went to zero. In its fluctuations, I'm going to use hand signals up here. There are sort of two digital readouts that go up and down. Ideally, they're even and torque is delivered by both engines, and the diodes will go up and down like this in unison to tell you that both engines are operating at optimal torque and they're even. So our instrument was doing this, and then what he saw was that it had gone all the way, and he interpreted that as we just lost an engine, when in fact it was just the meter itself doing a new dance.
We've got a question from Drew in a comment. He says, insane story, just wow. First, I want to say thank you for your service. My question is about flying post-incident. How long did it take you to feel comfortable to get back into the aircraft and start operating again?
Well, Drew, well, first, thanks for your kind words. Honored to serve. Good question. It took me a while to get back into the aircraft. And here's the strange thing about it. It turned out that I worried ultimately more about the other folks involved in my getting back into flying than I did about myself. I thought, oh my gosh, I'm the guy who crashed the plane, and now they have to get in the plane with me. And what are their thoughts on this? And is this guy a bad pilot? Is he horrible? Do we have to watch out for him? Has he recovered? What's in his head? I worried more about that, to be quite honest. But after a while, I got a little more comfortable. It's funny, I had, I'll have to share this with you. I had a moment with someone who went flying with me very shortly after. In fact, it may have been the first flight, an old friend of mine, after I got back in the air. And we were out doing exercise, and he says, man, you were like aggressive almost. You were flying aggressively. I was like, dude, relax, slow down. And I don't recall being that way. All I recall holistically over the following years was that I turned into the most careful, thoughtful, insightful, calm, and analytic pilot that I could be, especially in the realm of staying focused during emergencies. So I know I went off the rail there a little bit, but I felt comfortable fairly quickly, and my comfort level grew over time. I felt like I had sort of matured a lot.
Okay, well, now let's bring up hindsight. Question from Wesley. If you could go back to your pre-flight brief for that flight, what would you have briefed differently that might have prevented the mishap?
Well, it's interesting because my pre-brief changed after that mission, and a lot of it focused, not to be repetitive, on the idea that if we do have an emergency, then everybody's job is to help fly that plane. Most emergencies we encounter today, crew, are not going to kill us, but they will try to convince us to kill ourselves. So our business is all about flying the aircraft, altitude, airspeed, and then we'll worry about everything else. So flight mech in the back, if we have an emergency, unless you're fighting a fire behind you, your mission is to be over our shoulders and making sure we're doing our job. And so I think that given the same emergency, I would have remained exclusively focused on flying that plane and forgotten about the back. I was just like, Wes, leave the door open, leave those guys to their thing, whatever, get up here. Your job is to make sure we execute this and stay safe while we're flying this aircraft. And so I think that I adjusted afterward to compensate for that very thing. And I think, to answer your direct question, that would have helped. It would have helped. We have a problem with the instruments. Everyone's job is to fly right now. Clayton, get up.
I have a question from Tom. What, if any, autopilot functionality did the aircraft have? And if there was any, did the torque meter problem degrade the functionality?
Tom, that's a really, really good question. Because when they did first of all, we do have some autopilot features. They're rather complex. They have multiple different iterations of what you can select and what they'll do for you. But ultimately, the forensics of the wreckage found that our flight director uncoupled light was on at impact. So what we thought, or what the pilot at the controls thought he had selected for flight director operations, could very well have been, or at least the forensics are telling us, the flight director had uncoupled it. So whatever he had commanded the aircraft to do was no longer viable. That's a really good question.
Commander, we're coming up towards the top of the hour, but we've got a bunch of questions rolling in. Do you mind staying a little bit longer?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Question from Ken, asking, this mission itself doesn't sound like a search and rescue mission. Is that normal for the Coast Guard?
It is. We do a lot of search and rescue, of course, but not all of them are search and rescue. This was what we call a marine safety mission, because our mission really was within the Coast Guard realm of environmental protection and marine safety. And specifically, if you've ever operated in the Gulf of Mexico, you know how intense the petroleum industry is out there in the Gulf and on shore. So this was not uncommon for the Coast Guard to be addressing in a general sense, but for us, this specific thing, fly an aircraft out to the bayou to check on a leaky pipe, we had never been tasked with that before. So it was really, at the risk of, putting bad press out there, this really was about the equipment that they were testing to detect the oil, or at least that is my Brian personal opinion, really.
Question from Rick. I'm assuming he means the investigative board, did the investigative board recommend any Coast Guard level revision to any practices or procedures based on this incident?
Not that I know of, not at an institutional level. Some of the survival gear, as we briefly touched on, what was adjusted and discussed. We talked a little bit about the radar altimeter alarm, as far as where to set it and whether we heard it go off. That was of interest in that people said, well, your rad alt alarm going through 125 feet didn't go off, it didn't warn. And we concluded that it probably did go off, and that since we hear it every single time we descend through 125 feet, it ceased to mean anything to us. So that was an interesting point of discussion. Focus on airspeed altitude, of course, if not a policy change, became a little bit more focused at the Aviation Training Center. It's like, okay, altitude, airspeed, when we do the big four, we really mean it. Don't just rush through and say, yeah, everything looks good, moving on. But as far as like in black and white, if there were any, I cannot recall them.
We have a question from Jenny that deals with, I guess, just culture is the best way to describe it. She says, incredibly inspiring to hear such an honest, self-accountable recount of an aviation accident. What did you learn of the culture of the business in response to the accident and your choice to share insights from it?
Yeah, well, the culture, and I don't know, of course, where each of you folks operate or what you fly or how you fly, but one of the things I'll readdress is the idea that safety can often take a backseat to agendas, to pressure, to perceived pressure, if not explicit pressure, from paying customers, or in the military, maybe a commander, someone who's really motivated to get a certain thing done. And so the culture, I think, is shared with all of us, that there's always some pressure to go do this thing that doesn't feel right. I think having survived this particular incident, I almost became immune to that. I said, what are you going to do? Crash an airplane? No, I became a lot more resistant to the culture of you have to do this. And I'll pair that with a reminder to everybody that in the service where I chose to serve, we did go on risky missions. We did dangerous things all the time. And that danger was innately part of our mission set and our tradition and our lifestyle. However, when it came to iffy, non-urgent, as someone previously mentioned, non-search and rescue cases, I sort of saw the culture in a different way. I said, now it is my responsibility to become a devil's advocate in this situation, to become that pilot in command who says, you know what? No, what if we don't go? What happens? What happens if we don't go? Let's slow this train down a little bit. And I know this is a long-winded answer. I apologize. But I think we can all sort of relate to that whole, what is the pressure pushing this mission? Again, being an overbearing manager, paying customers, whatever the case may be. So I resisted by becoming the devil's advocate.
Well, that fits in with another question from Drew, which made me kind of smile when I saw it, and I probably shouldn't have smiled when you were giving your answer, but
Right.
he said, did the camera ever work?
No.
So
No,
yeah, talking about mission necessity, in the end of the camera works.
Yeah.
I probably shouldn't have anyway. And then Maury is asking, was there actually ever an oil release, which I don't think we probably ever got to, but
Yeah.
let me back up. A question from Ari, and looks like he's writing in from overseas, and he's asking more about the rescue kits and first aid kits. He is a first responder. One thing that I found very, very interesting today when I was looking through the demographic information for the audience, we have a significantly higher number of first responders today than we normally do, which I found really interesting. But anyway, he's asking, I think, if there is another crash and he's responding, is there a kit on board that he should be looking for to help providing services, or I'm not 100% certain, but I think that's what he's looking for.
Yeah, if Ari, you mean that a specific airframe will have a specific package of equipment, so to speak. If that's the question, I really don't know. I'd have to know what the organization is and what the airframe is and what mission profile they're dressed out for. But I would say if anyone is responding, kind of to flip the question to the question that wasn't asked, if anyone is responding to a situation like this, I'll warn you that the things you have to worry about are very sharp things in the water, lots of jet fuel, soaking everything, just waiting for something to ignite it. And yeah, that's really a lot of pulverized things, sharp things, and a lot of jet fuel. So beware.
From Larry, a different Larry, it looks like. No, I think it's the same one. Did the Coast Guard have a risk analysis of the mission in place at the time? I know that the Coast Guard for many years had the attitude, you have to go out, you don't have to come back. I know that that's changed significantly recently, comparatively. And so was there a risk analysis procedure in place at the time?
What most of you are probably imagining as a risk assessment process did not exist. There were no checklists with boxes and measurements or numbers or evaluations that were official, so to speak. It was, in fact, this may very well have helped usher us into that era of official risk assessment tools and beginning to explore something a little more solid that we can look at as sort of a neutral measure of what we're getting into. So the simple answer is no, we didn't have an official one, but I think this helped bring about the day of reckoning for that.
A couple of questions from Laura. She said, number one, do you know if the person who rescued you in the airboat was part of the Cajun Navy? And she also asked, you showed us a black screen indicating what you saw out there when you launched.
Yeah.
How did you manage to navigate without NVGs?
Oh, well, we knew where we were going and we had a rough idea. You know, we could see the ground, so to speak. There was some ambient light. I guess the black screen was really for effect, just to tell you that it was a dark night. So yeah, we were very confident heading out there, south of the air station there. There's really nothing. We had our computer, we had our lat long, we had our arrow, we knew where we were going. We had a chart, so to speak, if we needed it, via our sectional. And yeah, no issues with getting where we were going. It was just standard ops, I guess, for nighttime in the bayou. So until the fog bank showed up, which again, none of us had ever seen before, which is kind of bizarre.
Well, and the address or the question about the person in the airboat, did you ever happen to find out how they chose to come find you, or did they just have to?
Apparently, and again, I wish, again, this goes back to the regret. I wish I had paid more attention regarding that crew. He was with one other person. It might have been a partner, or it might have been like a older teenage son. I don't know. And believe it or not, I dropped the ball on following up on exactly who he was and how he found his way into that mission. Especially, 0 dark 30 in the bayou. But I don't know.
The last question will come from Robert. He says, have you written a book yet?
Oh, no. Oh, interesting. First time I've ever gotten that one. No, but Robert, I do endeavor to tell this story as much as I can. I have done that for a little bit, and I continue to get feedback from folks that inspires me to keep telling the story. A book, that's interesting. Maybe I could roll this into like a nice long fiction book of some sort of adventure story, but no, I'm not yet.
I did miss one. It looks like Gustavo was asking if you would agree that the one good thing about an accident, a survivable accident, is it will never happen again.
Yeah, well, this particular mishap won't happen again. But for those of you who, well, I'll just leave it right there. Yes, Gustavo, thank you for that. I don't think I will ever descend undetected into terrain ever again, ever.
Okay, I've apparently been motionless long enough that the office lights just shut down. So
oh my goodness,
bring it back up. Interesting.
There you go.
There had a couple questions did come in, but I think we do need to wrap things up. I will say that we received a number of very complimentary written statements for you. We'll make sure we share those with you afterwards. I would like to finish up with our final typical routine question. We haven't asked it in a little while, but what's the one thing that you wish that people would take away from this presentation today?
Wow. Well, I would say when you're evaluating a mission for your crew's safety, it is very easy to be carried away by the intensity, by the perceived urgency, by the perceived importance of what people are telling you, or what people are demanding of you, or what people are trying to convince you of. This is super important. I would ask that you simply remember those folks, those 9 out of 10 folks who stepped over that man who needed help, and to not be one of those. Fall back on your bedrock principles of, look, I'm not trying to be difficult. I'm not trying to be a bad pilot. I'm not trying to ruin our mission. I'm simply asking very pertinent questions that should be asked. So pardon me if, and again, I'm being a little, flip there, but stick to your guns and simply saying, no, this is professional aviation process. I need to know about the urgency. We need to know the facts about this mission, because there are heavy risks that you're asking us to take, and we're just being prudent and professional. and just stay there with your stance. Don't back off and say, okay, until it's time to do so, I guess. I don't know what your culture is. I don't know where you fly or how you fly. But I would just say, remember those 9 people who stepped over that man.
Commander Wexler, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Thank you so much for your time back during the BAST conference. Your story is just so compelling that I could not help but pass, to bring it back to our webinar series. So I am very grateful for your time today.
No, I'm grateful for the invitation, the opportunity. Thanks so much. I hope you folks out there watching still have taken a little bit away from our time together today. I really hope that I wasn't wasting your time. To any coasties who might be watching, especially anybody whom I flew with, Semper Paratus. Hopefully, maybe talk to you soon.
Thank you so much, Commander. And I'll let you close your screen, and I need to bring my screen up now to wrap things up here.
Outstanding. All right. Bye, y'all.
Thank you, sir. Okay, well, I hope you all enjoyed that as much as I did. Like I said, I've heard it twice now, and I felt that it was just something that was so valuable I wanted to bring back. We do have a couple of gaps coming up. We're reaching the end of the year, and so we do have some holidays that are coming up. We do not have a webinar next week, the traditional 4th Thursday of the month. That is a Thanksgiving holiday here in the United States. We hope that if you're in the US that you are able to enjoy some time with family and friends and perhaps overindulge at the dinner table. December 8th, our webinar is another one in our series of MIL to CIV, the military to civilian transition. This time we're going to be focusing on the maintenance people, the guys who are men and women who are turning the wrenches, keeping the aircraft in the air, keeping them flying. We know that the transition is every bit as important for you when you decide to make the transition, leave the military and enter the civilian world. And so we want to get your questions answered. Again, we have a panel of experts who have made this jump before you, and they're willing to share everything that they've learned. We will have a gap after that. There's a number of international holidays through the end of December, early part of January. We hope that everybody is able to enjoy a very peaceful and prosperous period in bringing into the new year. January 5th, we'll resume our webinars. We are waiting for a couple of different things to fall into place, and then we will announce our schedule for the coming year. I know that we have a bunch that also came from this Vertical Aviation Safety Conference, and they're every bit as interesting. We do ask that you take time to fill out a survey that should be coming to the audience fairly soon. One of the questions I'm always interested in is what webinar would you like to see us address? We also ask, as always, to let our president, James Viola, know if there's anything that HAI can do. We, as a membership organization, are always very, very interested in what we can do to help the industry. We're working on different things like insurability. We're working on things like workforce development. And so we know that our industry, a lot of mom and pop operations, what are the things that you feel like we could be doing? And so please let us know. The best way to do that is to reach out to our president, James Viola, directly. Use his president@rotor.org email address. He does read every single thing that comes in. One of the things that we also try to do is provide a news service for the rotorcraft and vertical takeoff and landing industry. A couple great ways to do that is through Rotor Magazine and Rotor Daily. You can subscribe to both of those through the website rotor.org/subscribe. Rotor Daily is a daily news aggregator that comes out every business day, aside from federal holidays, that covers some of the top stories that are part of our industry for that day. You could search for them yourself, but hey, let us just mail them right to you, email them to you each day. It's a great time to take a break in the middle of the day or later in the day and read the top stories. Rotor Magazine is an award-winning publication that we produce. It covers a lot of the stories more in depth, and we want to make sure that it's something that you want to read. Rotor Magazine, Rotor Daily are both free. If you are living outside the United States, Rotor Magazine does have a small fee for to help with shipping, international shipping. That's the only cost involved, and that is addressed in the rotor.org subscribe page. That does conclude our webinar for this week. Again, the holidays are coming up. We wish everybody the best next week, and then we're looking forward to see you in early December. Until then, we ask that you fly safe, that you be safe, and we'll see you again very, very soon.